Backstory: Germany deployed almost 1,100 submarines during World War II, while Japan built over 600, but the United States had an abnormally tiny submarine force of only 252 boats. Nevertheless, 54.6% of all Japanese Navy and mercantile ships sunk were American submarines, the majority of which served in the Pacific. But in gathering these figures, the U.S. over 3,400 soldiers, or 22% of the force, were killed, and 52 submarines were lost, resulting in significant losses for the submarine force. Even so, he joined in the United States at the age of 17 with his father's approval. John Ronald Smith of Hammond, Indiana, known to his friends as Ron or Smitty, was eager to reimburse the Japanese for Pearl Harbor in the summer of 1942. He became a torpedo man in the aft torpedo room, the caboose, of the Salmon-class USS Seal SS-183, after completing boot camp and becoming qualified as a submariner. This was during a period when American torpedoes were nearly criminally unreliable, and the U.S. submarine force was still establishing its credibility. This article is an adaptation of Ron Smith and Flint Whitlock's The Depths of Courage, American Submariners at War with Japan, 1941 to 1945. Battle stations are underwater. Point: The alert was raised at 7 a.m. on May 4, 1943, while the crew of the U.S. submarine Seal was having breakfast. Battle stations submerged. On the surface, a Japanese convoy had been observed. The sub moved softly beneath the surface as the motormen turned off the diesels and the maneuvering room's electricians switched to batteries. Every guy hurried to his battle station, and all regular activities on Seal came to a halt. The guys hastily took the bunks out of the aft torpedo room and put them away in the aft engine room. The 4 additional torpedoes in the chamber were then supported by horizontal I-beams that swung into position across the front and back of the compartment in case reloading was required. With a microphone pressed against his throat and headphones on his ears, Smitty assumed his combat station, sitting between the aft tubes, his gaze fixed on the torpedo data computer transmitter, TDC, mounted on the back bulkhead. Smitty looked around at his fellow sailors in the cramped area, a motley, unmilitary-looking bunch, as the sub proceeded toward the intercept position. Everyone wore a variety of filthy skivvy shirts with the sleeves ripped off, or brilliantly colorful Hawaiian shirts, sandals and no socks, and torn, cut-off dungaree shorts. Everybody was sweating profusely. Some wore dark blue navy baseball caps over their unclean, stringy hair. A few young men, like Smitty, had the first straggling hints of facial hair, while those old enough to shave had full beards. But each man was a master of his lethal art. John Big Ski Kosmarowski, who was short and powerful, appeared assured, much like a quarterback in a close game. Malin Woody Woodard, a dependable man in a sub-versus-ship duel, stood behind him, providing backup. Slim Dillingham, known as Seagull, was a torpedo man without a rival. 2 more seamen, Brown and Deadeye, were waiting, willing to assist with the reloading by offering their considerable muscle. With a casual, almost arrogant expression on their faces, each man seemed to be saying, "No big deal, we've done this 100 times before," which helped to ease Smitty's growing indigestion and cover up any anxiety they may have been feeling. First fire, second fire, third fire. As Seal prepared to intercept the convoy, Lieutenant John Haynes, in the control room amidships, had already started the plot. It was Smitty's responsibility to align the marks on the dial of the TDC transmitter to the ongoing into the tin fish. He would push the big brass firing lever only if, after receiving the command to fire, the marks, or bugs as they were called, were perfectly aligned. The TDC was being fed the target's distance, angle, and speed, information that was then entered into the torpedo's primitive brains. A precise plan would increase the likelihood that the fish would strike their targets, but even with perfect bugs, no one could be sure that the torpedoes would really explode because of innumerable malfunctions. Smitty informed those around him that Haynes, known as Control, had called for the other 58 officers and enlisted men in SEAL to stand by for action over the headset. The aft torpedo room was ordered to stand easy for the time being, while the front torpedo room was placed on alert. After entering the target's distance and range into the TDC, a fat oiler with the distinctly un-Japanese name of San Clemente Maru, the forward torpedo room was instructed to fire one, and the boat abruptly lurched as if it had struck a brick wall. Fire two, fire three. The tin fish were violently ejected from their tubular homes by 2,000 pounds of compressed air pressure from the impulse bottle. 2 additional lurches followed. The sonar man, Lumpy Lemon, reported over the circuit, all fish running hot, straight, and normal. Lehman had an exceptionally keen, discriminating set of ears. He could tell the officers how many ships were present, what kinds of ships were in the convoy, how fast the ships were moving, and even which way they were going, based on the faint shooshing of screws from as far away as 20 miles. Some of the wags on Seals War Lumpy were even able to identify the ship's registration numbers. Awaiting effects. They all waited now. Or would there be silence? Or would the torpedoes hit home? Some men toyed with some kind of amulet that they believed would bring them luck, or they crossed their fingers or fingered the crucifixes that hung from their necks. It's possible that some of Seal's crew members briefly considered the enemy sailors that the torpedoes were aimed at, unaware that their world was about to be destroyed and that their lives would soon come to an abrupt and horrific end. These sailors had moms, fathers, husbands, girlfriends, and kids at home, just like the Americans. Like the Americans, the majority of these sailors were merely carrying out a task that had been assigned to them by a higher authority. The majority of these sailors, like the Americans, would have liked to engage in other, more tranquil activities throughout their childhood. However, the Americans believed that thinking about the adversary in such a personal way and dwelling on such ideas was unhealthy. No, they had to consider the enemy as just that, the enemy, and try to eliminate as many of them as they could, because that was the nature of battle. The Japanese, after all, were responsible for the unexpected bombing of Pearl Harbor, the ruthless invasion of Korea, China, Malaysia, and the Philippines, the enslavement of thousands of Korean girls and young women, the decapitation of captured Australian, British, and American soldiers and airmen, the massacre of American and Filipino prisoners of war during the March from Bataan, and other atrocities that were just as heinous as those carried out by the Nazis on the opposite side of the globe. Therefore, if the men inside SEAL had such thoughts, they forced them from their brains and eagerly awaited the explosions that would indicate that the hated Japanese enemy sailors were descending to their deaths in misery. The second hand sweeping around the gleaming bulkhead timepiece was the men's main attention in the aft torpedo room. As the time for the intercept passed, Woody murmured, "First one missed." Additionally, the second and third torpedoes vanished into failure's silence. "Tubes aft, hold on. Tubes aft, stand by." Smitty heard Lieutenant Haynes's voice in his headphones as SEAL's captain, Lieutenant Commander Harry B. Dodge, USNA 1930, swung the sub around to allow the aft torpedoes to be fired while the front torpedo room reloaded. Smitty responded, straightening his stance somewhat and adopting a slightly more military stance. "Tubes aft, standing by." For his fellow crew members' benefit, Smitty reiterated, "Stand by." As the youngest and newest member of the team, he was now being given the opportunity to demonstrate his abilities by giving these old salts orders. This was his first major battle exam, and he hoped he would pass. Crewmen hurried to their firing positions. They didn't know or care if they were aiming for a carrier, battleship, cruiser, destroyer, oiler, tanker, freighter, or transport. Haynes said, "Tubes aft, stand by 5, 6, and 7. Smitty repeated, "Tubes aft, standing by 5, 6, and 7. "Tubes aft, open outer doors on 5, 6, and 7, Haynes instructed. Smitty said, "Tubes aft, aye," and gave Big Ski and Seagull the same order. To equalize pressure to the sea, they flooded the 3 firing chambers with seawater by opening the valves from the water-round torpedo, a tank situated directly beneath the torpedo tubes. Normally, during an attack, the 4th aft tube, number 8, was kept back. "Outer doors on 5, 6, and 7 are open," Smitty said. Haynes said, Tubes aft, switch on firing circuits on 5, 6, and 7, and Smitty reiterated the order. After throwing the switches that armed the torpedoes, Seagull signaled to Smitty that everything was fine. Smitty informed Haynes, firing circuits on for 5, 6, and 7. Excellent. Tubes aft. 12 feet is the set depth. As the tube's dials were adjusted to the desired depth, Smitty remarked, set depth 12 feet. Tubes aft. Aye. At 5 o'clock, Haynes said, Aye. Tubes aft. Stand by 5. Smitty kept an eye on the dials and waited for the TDC's marks to align. Set off 5. Smitty hit the tube's firing button just as Haynes, 50 yards away, pressed the button for number 5 as the bugs aligned, ensuring that the torpedo would still shoot even if the electric circuit failed. The torpedo was released with a deep-throated boom, a deafening whoosh of compressed air, and a shower of water that sprayed into the compartment from around the tube's gasket. The identical process was used for tubes 6 and 7, but Smitty was upset with himself since he knew that number 6 would miss its objective when he launched it, just as the TDC markers were 2 degrees out of alignment. Shortly after the fish was discharged, Big Ski was having issues with the gasket on the number 7 tube while cursing a blue streak. 8-inch flood. Although it wasn't yet a serious issue, it couldn't be disregarded. Over the sound of the surging water, Woody shouted, "Hit the emergency valve! Shut up! Point!" Big Ski walked over to Tube 7 and cranked the manual control wheel really hard. Ski was a soaked, pouring disaster before the stream of water was slowly choked off. Haynes ordered, "Tubes aft, close outer doors." Big Ski and Seagull turned the outer doors shut after Smitty said, "Tubes aft, close outer doors. Aye." Lumpy Lehman reported on sonar that all of the fish were running hot, straight, and normal. "We strike a bitch's sun." Point. The first torpedo's clockmaker then declared that it had missed. In the aft torpedo room, the crew sagged. They all thought, "Damn these defective fish." A thundering noise and a jolt that seemed to have been caused by a big sledgehammer struck the sub a few seconds later. "We struck the bitch's sun," Big Ski yelled. Torpedo number 6 was the one Smitty was certain would miss. As if their team had scored the game-winning touchdown, the crew members started jumping up and down, yelling, hollering, and patting each other on the back. How fortunate can you get? Smitty pondered in his mind. Haynes said, "Tubes aft, begin your reload." And well done, Smitty. Smitty said, "Tube aft start reload, aye." And thanks, Haynes. Submarine seamen did not address the officers by their ranks or as sir, with the exception of the skipper. They lifted and then lowered the periscope. The executive officer, Frank Greenup, came over the intercom. He declared, "We just sank a large transport freighter. There appear to be many men in the water." The aft torpedo room erupted in cheers once more, and additional joyous dances were performed. Smitty was given the new moniker, War Shot, by the crew. Artillerists can observe the effects of their salvos, while infantrymen can simply glance to see if their rounds are hitting the target. Gunners on surface ships can watch the destruction their shells create, while airmen aboard bombers can look down at the terrain and see their bombs hitting home. However, submariners are only able to depend on auditory evidence and are not allowed to see their marksmanship, except for the officer operating the periscope. The guys in SEAL, however, could hear the 7,354-ton San Clemente Maru breaking apart as it sank, even without sonar headphones. Then, "Ka-lump!" The boilers erupted. "Ka-lump!" SEAL was shaken, and the chinaware in her galley rattled as the shock waves struck her. Then, as the vessel fell more into the ocean, they heard the cracking and popping sounds as the bulkheads gave way. With sickening interest, Smitty told himself that was the sound of a dying ship. 200 feet below the sea level. "There are 2 escorts up there looking for us now," Greenup said, interrupting the crew's jubilation and reverie. "For depth charge, rig. Set up a silent running rig. All waterproof doors should be closed." SEAL's crewmen immediately performed the action they had rehearsed 1,000 times. Dogged down, the watertight doors between chambers swung shut on their huge hinges. The air-flowing bulkhead flappers between the compartments were shut off. To ensure that the escape hatch wouldn't burst from the shock of the depth charges and flood the interior, Big Ski went up into it. They turned off the air conditioner. The electric engines were turned off so that not even the sluggish rotation of the propeller screws would reveal their position as the ship seal plunged to 200 feet, where the oceanic pressure on the hull reached 90 pounds to the square inch. It was completely forbidden to talk, move about, drop a tool, or do anything that could produce even the smallest sound. Every submariner feared this moment. The hunter was now the hunted. The worm had turned. SEAL's crew was aware that the enemy's destroyers were circling overhead, trying to find them, while they toiled away below. The warship's sonar operators were pinging, sending electronic signals into the deep sea and listening for the telltale echo that would alert them to the presence of a huge metallic object, using submarine locating equipment. Depth charges would start to rain down on the still victim as soon as they heard the echo. At times, the depth charging would continue for hours, and at other times, there would only be a few charges. Nobody knew for sure how or when it would end. The American depth charges, which had 242 pounds of explosive and detonated at a comparatively shallow depth of no more than 150 feet, were thought to be more powerful than the Japanese depth charges. The submarines were generally safe when they dove to 200 feet or more, although this was not always the case. No one knew how many submarines failed to return because a lucky shot had destroyed a valve on a ballast tank, split the pressure hull, or damaged the propulsion or steering mechanism, making it impossible for the sub to gain positive buoyancy and surface. The charges could still be extremely deadly. The depth charges thunder. Abruptly, Smitty and his companions in the aft torpedo room realized they had a problem, a serious one. Torpedoes had already been placed into tubes 5 and 7 when the order to rig for depth charges was given, but the torpedo for tube 6 was only halfway in. The steel hull was crushed by the outside pressure as Seal Dove reached 200 feet, making it a tight fit for the torpedoes. As a result, the torpedo in number 6 tube became trapped. Everyone was aware that a depth charge at the stern may cause the outer door to tube 6 to jar open, resulting in an unexpected surge of seawater. The explosion could kill everyone inside the sealed-off compartment and make it difficult, if not impossible, for the sub to surface. It could even tear the outer door off its hinges, blow the torpedo back into the compartment, and flood the aft torpedo room. The crew tried to push the tin fish home by manhandling it, but it refused to move. It was the trigger mechanism, and Smitty had heard someone tell him that he would hear a click just before the depth charge exploded. This would enable everyone in the boat a split second to grab something, grit their teeth, and hang on. Then it took place. Click! Kabloom! As anticipated, water started to rush into the compartment from around the protruding torpedo as soon as a depth charge went off at the stern. Click! Kabloom! One more, and then another. The entire sub jerked and rocked as if some enormous water beast were beating Seal with its hideous fists, and the lights flickered on and out. Click! Kabloom! The glass faces of gauges in the sub broke with every explosion. After popping and sizzling, the light bulbs went out. Paint chips and cork insulation flew. Cockroaches ran for cover. Water was still pouring in from around the partially placed torpedo, and the boat's welded seams appeared ready to break. Before the ocean floods in, "Get that dang thing in there," Woody shouted. The tin fish refused to move, despite Brown and Deadeye's best block and tackle efforts. Big Ski, who was 5 feet and 5 inches, tried to assist by grasping the line in front of Deadeye, but Deadeye pushed him aside and branded him a stupid Polak. With a tube door crank in his grasp, Big Ski slipped on the damp deck and prepared to crack Deadeye's head. For a while, it appeared as though the two Americans had declared war on one another as Deadeye seized a mallet. Click! Kabloom! Click! Kabloom! Nearby, 2 additional charges detonated, severely shaking Seal and jolting the two fighters back to reality. The exterior door could blow at any time, and more water poured in. Big Ski yanked the chock and block and tackle from the back of the torpedo, dropped the crank handle, and pushed past Deadeye and the others. Then he took a cloth from his back pocket, pressed it to the back of the fish, and, with a grunt and an almost superhuman force, pushed the torpedo all the way into the tube by himself. They all looked on in astonished disbelief. Nobody, especially not a 5'5" person, could accomplish that on their own. Thus, it was a miracle. Click. Kabloom. As Smitty turned it around into the dogs and latched it, Seagull Dillingham snapped out of his brief daze and slammed the inner door to Tube 6. Big Ski fell to the deck, exhausted, his head between his knees, his veins bulging like snakes, his breath coming in clumps, and he was sweating profusely. Without a word, they all walked carefully and silently around him. Click. Kabloom. Click. Kabloom. Smitty prayed the depth charges would stop soon because they were still coming down hard and quickly. 10 or 15 more blasts later, the hammering ceased. Though it felt like several eternities to Smitty, the entire combat had taken roughly 4 hours. The SEAL's flight. Control, tubes aft, Smitty said softly into the neck mic. Every tube was reloaded. Excellent. Tubes aft. Be at ease. With the sub-hunters gone, SEALSWAM quietly left the area, moving at a steady 3 knots. Eventually, it was decided to protect against silent running and depth charges. The bunks were put back where they belonged in the torpedo chambers. The boat surfaced, and fresh air flooded in. Men collapsed into them, exhausted. Smitty assessed himself. To his surprise, he had been exhilarated but not very frightened because it had been his first time fighting. He had been too busy to be truly afraid. He also became aware that he was more worn out than he had ever been. He slid into a berth as soon as one became available, which was merely a rigid mattress covered in green plastic. His nose was only 3 inches from the oil pan beneath the electric motor that operated the stern plates, which had a horsepower of 30. He quickly dozed off despite the sound of the machine. A few weeks later, in June 1943, SEAL left Midway to start her 7th War Patrol, following a refurbishment and extensive more training. SEALs were to patrol in Japanese waters off the home island of Honshu, which is a highly dangerous region, around 3,000 miles from Midway, in accordance with the covert orders in the sub's safe. A tempest at sea. Siren turned into a typhoon, the Orient's equivalent of a hurricane, after 5 days at sea. The crew was persuaded that this was no typical storm when they plunged into waves taller than homes. Everything unsecured in the sub had to be tied down or tightly stowed because the boat was rolling 30 degrees from side to side. To prevent them from being thrown onto the deck, sleeping men even needed to be tied into their bunks. Everyone experienced severe seasickness, with the exception of the saltiest of old salts. Smitty offered to be the starboard lookout for a topside watch during the storm's peak. I was unable to eat and sleep, he remarked. Might as well accomplish something beneficial. Ron Smith had never encountered anything so strong and furious as the storm. The rain appeared to be pouring from all directions at once, and the wind was pelting the rocking submarine at up to 100 miles per hour. The SEAL was being beaten like a shuttlecock from wave to wave. A lifeline was tied around Smitty's waist, fastened to the railing, and he held on while on topside watch. According to Smitty, a swell would form like a hole in the ocean 50 to 70 feet deep, with a black wall on the other side just as high. SEAL would plunge into the hole like an airplane during a freefall dive, then slam into the opposite side's wall of water, shuddering as she wallowed back up and over it. The majority of the waves swept over the boat, and as Smitty saw it beginning to crest over him, he closed his eyes, held his breath, and hung on as tight as he could. The black wave would then crash down, slamming at him like a huge wet fist, attempting to tear him away from the boat's precarious protection and cast him into the ocean. One positive aspect of the storm was that Japanese sailors would be fighting Mother Nature rather than the Americans if any enemy ships were out there in the raging sea. Smitty was finally glad after getting soaked to the bone and thrashed around in the rain for several hours. He fought his way below, where it was dry. He took cover in the pitching mess hall and snatched up a mug of hot coffee that was splashing all over him. He proceeded to the control room by dripping. "Chief, why are we letting this play out on the surface?" He questioned Red Cervenas, a seasoned submariner and old salt. "Why don't we simply go under the water and leave this mess behind?" Point. Cervenak replied, "I didn't realize it was going to be this bad. It would be challenging to dive right in. In the diving tanks, we would most likely add as much air as water. We might not be able to dive." Leaning against the gyroscope table for balance, Lieutenant Jack Frost, the diving and engineering officer, joined the discussion. "Smith, it's better that we ride it out on the surface. Take it, SEAL Can. She is a strong young woman." Smitty, who remained doubtful, nodded and went back to the aft torpedo room, or caboose, where he undressed, wrung off, and re-put on his soaking clothes before slipping into a bunk and fastening his straps. He sighed resignedly at the state of affairs, thinking at least my clothing were washed. 3 days later, the storm passed, and SEAL swam toward Honshu in calm waters once more. The USS Runner's fate. SEAL finally arrived off the northeast coast of Honshu, the enemy's front yard, after a week, half of which had been spent fighting the storm, and the other half practicing war maneuvers to hone the crew's combat skills. At this latitude, where daylight lasts for 20 hours every day, Dodge kept SEAL submerged for the majority of the day, only emerging for roughly 4 hours to recharge the batteries. It was dangerous since she would have to dive and leave quickly if the adversary spotted her, and she had no idea what would happen if the batteries weren't fully charged. Traffic was great for being this close to Japan. Ships moved to the left and right, but Dodge waited, remaining low and without firing. Everyone was curious as to why they were waiting. No one knew why, but one day the sub was filled with the faint thumping of depth charges detonating far away. One of the torpedo men told Smitty, who was wearing headphones, to ask Control what was happening. "Control, aft tubes. Back here, we hear explosions." "What's happening?" Smitty inquired. Cowboy. Hendricks, a sailor who was answering the phones in the control room, said, "Tube aft, Control. We also hear it. It's clearly not for us, but I'm not sure what it is. Too far away." Big Ski said to Smitty, "Ask him if anyone else is nearby." According to Cowboy, the executive officer, Mr. Greenup, believed that Runner was close by, south of SEAL. Even though the explosions were still far away, their pace quickened, like to the last minute of a 4th of July fireworks display. A sailor named Lago remarked, "It sounds like they're working someone over pretty good." Men listened and glanced at the bulkheads. The beating ceased around 9 p.m., and the crew and SEAL relaxed a bit. Then Lumpy Lehman, who had detected an emergency signal, came on over the circuit around 45 minutes later. "It sounds similar to the Runner. Hard to read, weak signal. They seem to be claiming to be stuck in the mud or something, unable to make it out." The voice of Lieutenant Haynes entered. "Control sound. They may have run aground. Continue to listen." "That's right," Lehman said. SEAL's men were silent. It was obvious. Runner had most likely fallen. There was a sister submarine dying, or dead. There was a chilling silence throughout SEAL. They were aware that it might also be their destiny. An ingenious move. On July 7th, 1943, at 10 p.m., SEAL surfaced once more in the dark to refuel. In order to get as much juice into the lead-acid batteries as possible in the limited amount of time allowed, all 4 diesels operated at maximum capacity. Radar detected the blips of a sizable convoy streaming north at 12 knots around 3:40 the following morning, consisting of 3 major transports, 5 or 6 smaller ships, and a few escorts. Only the starboard side of the convoy was visible as it hugged the coastline, allowing SEAL Little some leeway. In order to intercept the convoy, Dodge sent Ceylon on a northerly course at flank speed on the surface, figuring it was worth a try despite the danger. Men rehearsed their engagement preparation processes all over the yacht. She went to battle stations that were underwater and dove to the periscope depth when SEAL came to the ambush spot. The TDC was fed target distance, speed, and range. Everything was prepared for assault. A Japanese sub was heading in for the kill when Lumpy Lehman abruptly reported, "Small fast screws closing from port side." Dodge gave the order, "Drop her to 150 feet." Lieutenant Frost gave the order to open all of the ballast tank vents, which caused Ceylon to plummet sharply. The order had not been given too soon, since just above them, every hand on board heard the characteristic high-pitched scream of a torpedo tearing through the sea. The sound almost made Smitty leap out of his skin. Dodge commanded, "Periscope depth," and Seal rose in response. The convoy was still going to be attacked. Haynes said, "Stand by, tubes forward." Rick big whop. Bonino said, "Tubes forward, standing by, aye," with a trace of joy in his voice. As Dodge positioned Cilinto for a shot from the bow tubes, Smitty listened carefully through his headphones. Smitty visualized his colleagues in the forward torpedo room, carrying out all necessary preparations for the assault. Dodge replied, "Fire one," and Seal lurched as the compressed air kicked him. In rapid succession, 2 additional torpedoes departed the submarine. "All ahead full," Dodge said. "Go ahead, begin reloading. Bring her down to 100 feet. Haynes said, "Tubes aft, stand by. Open the 5th, 6th, and 7th doors." "We're going under a bitch's sun," Big Ski cried out. "He will fall directly on top of us if he gets struck by those first 3 fish," Lago shouted. "Lago, stop that shit," yelled Woody. The torpedoman started to crank open the outer tube doors, saying, "The old man knows what he's doing." Everyone understood now. Fire from the bow tubes, pass beneath the target, then use the stern tubes to strike him once more from the opposite side. As far as Smitty knew, no one had ever attempted such a smart approach. However, weren't they too near the coast? Once she was on the other side of the target ship, wouldn't Seal Run run aground? "We've reached 365 feet, point." As Haynes's voice crackled in Smitty's headphones, there was no time to worry. Tubes behind, in charge, be ready to shoot 5. As Smitty stared at the TDC box, waiting for the bugs to line up, he said, "Tubes aft, standing by to fire 5. Aye." Abruptly, click. Boom, click. Kabloom, click, kabloom. The caboose was thrown into complete darkness as the light bulbs blew out, and 3 shock waves crashed into and through Seal. As soon as the torque that had twisted the ship caused the pipes to burst, water started to shoot out, making it extremely cold and damp. Men were shouting warnings, issuing orders, praying, yelling, and swearing. To avoid himself from being flung around the blackened room with all its harsh projecting objects, Smitty instinctively stretched out and grasped anything he could find. The boat tilted upward at an angle that made him sick. The faint emergency lighting turned on at that precise moment. Big Ski looked at the depth gauge and said, "Holy Mother of God. We've reached 365 feet. The 200 pounds of pressure per square inch caused the ancient hull to groan. Everyone was aware that Seal had never dived this deep before, and that her greatest test depth was 90 feet shallower. Click. Kabloom. Get ready for a depth charge. Get ready to run quietly. Control gave the command. Terrified beyond belief, Smitty repeated it. As the aft torpedo crew secured the outer tube doors, shut the bulkhead flappers, and dragged down the watertight door, someone wisecracked, "A little late for that." Click. Kabloom. What on earth went wrong? Someone insisted on knowing. Woody answered, "The sons of bitches caught us with our pants down." Click. Kabloom. Seal shivered as if he were being battered by a smokestack-sized baseball bat. Deadeye yelled, "We're getting gangbanged," while clinging to a loading rack. Ruptured lines were still spouting water into the chamber. Near Smitty's station, the freezing water was knee-deep and becoming deeper due to the deck's upward slant. Click. Kabloom. Click. Kabloom. Click. Kabloom! 7 Japanese destroyers had positioned themselves between the convoy and the coast, out of sight of the SEAL's radar and periscope, but the crew of the SEAL were unaware of this at the time. The enemy tin cans had swung through the convoy at the first volley of torpedoes, pinged SEAL, and began dropping their lethal ordnance. SEAL had encountered a captain, or 7 of them, who could drop depth charges down the hatch. Click. Kabloom. Click. Kabloom. Click. Kabloom. Smitty was astounded to see that the steel bulkheads actually bowed and moved with each shock, as if the sub were composed of aluminum foil, as sound and pressure waves echoed through the hull. The deck, coated in an oily layer, made it impossible for the men in the caboose to gain traction as they attempted to go higher and away from the increasing water. The air was chilly by the water, which was only a few degrees above freezing, and the men could see their breath clouds. Click. Kabloom. Click. Kabloom. Click. Kabloom. Reports of damage. Over his headphones, Smitty conveyed the grim news to his fellow crew members as damage reports from the various subsections came in thick and fast. The forward torpedo room is flooded, a gasket on the sound head is leaking, the control room is dry, but the pump room is flooded almost to the control room hatch. The after battery room has some water, still about 8 inches from the batteries. This final piece of information was particularly concerning since if the water got to the batteries, it would react with the acid to produce chlorine gas, which would kill everyone on board. Smitty kept updating his friends, saying, "The forward engine room reports minor leaks, not much water in the bilges. The decks were flooded in the after engine room. Outer doors closed, water about halfway up the deck. Stern depth gauges reading 365 feet, Smitty reported to Control. "Very well, tubes aft," Control said calmly. Smitty questioned how Haynes could remain so composed in such a situation, but the officer's composure calmed Smitty down. Perhaps, he thought to himself, things aren't as bad as they seem. "What time is it?" Smitty shifted to allow Cassidy to view the timepiece when he asked a torpedo man named Hopalong. "The answer is 0720, Smitty said. The date was July 9th, 1943. He questioned whether he would make it to July 10th. "That's the closest it gets." "Less than an hour has passed since the attack began," Woody uttered incredulously. They appeared to have been under fire for hours at a time. It was claimed that the depth charging had concluded some 30 minutes prior. Although they were beginning to breathe more easily, they were still concerned that water may get to the batteries. Control declared, "All compartments, we're going to try to correct our trim," but as soon as the valves were noisily released, more depth charges poured down. Click. Kabloom! Click. Kabloom! Click. Kabloom! Smitty subsequently said, "There is no way to describe the sound of a depth charge. It's the only sound like it. 10 times louder than a big bomb, worse than the loudest thunder, and so strong that it transcends the range of audible physical sounds and transforms into a pressure wave. Click. Kabloom! Click. Kabloom! Click. Kabloom!" The crewman Brown snarled, his knuckles white from gripping an I-beam. "It don't get no closer than that." The charges continued in an apparently unending torrent. Click, kabloom, click, kabloom, click, kabloom. The sailors started to believe that the enemy ships were going back to port, reloading, and then returning to drop more because there were so many explosions. Perhaps SEAL was being sunk with all of Japan's depth charges. Smitty became quite frightened. Even though his fellow crew members were the best in the business, they were powerless to defend themselves, deflect the blasts with a shield, or use a magic wand to stop the bombing and make the enemy vanish. Click. Kabloom, click. Kabloom, click. Kabloom. "When will it be over, Lord?" went through the minds of each man. "Do you think we'll put up with any more of this shit?" Lieutenant Frost, the diving officer, could not alter SEAL's trim to change her odd angle. Every time they attempted to pump water from the tanks, more depth charges would descend, when the Japanese sonar guys heard the commotion. Without a doubt, they had sealed her to the mat and had no intention of releasing her. 3 more hours went by, yet the attack on the eardrums and nerves continued unabated. "Sound, do you have any information for us?" At one point, Control questioned Lumpy Lehman. The first time anyone had heard of the number of hunters up there, they said, "Control, I make 7 destroyers and some smaller craft nearby, probably destroyer escorts." The cannonade never appeared to stop, which is understandable. "Very well, Sound," Control said softly, once more without feeling, as though he had just received a forecast for clear skies and calm waters. The aft torpedo chamber was growing colder by the minute. "Is this where I'm buried? Am I going to die right here?" Smitty thought. He pondered his father's reaction to the news. Anne Shirley, his girlfriend from Hammond. Not even a body will be left for them to bury. The idea made him feel even more down. "Looks like our wagon train was circled by the Indians." "It sounds like they're circling us and taking turns running across the circle and dropping a load on us," Lumpy Lehman said in his assessment of the scenario. The men in the caboose chuckled a little more than they might have normally done when Smitty repeated what he had heard, and Brown attempted to defuse the situation by saying, "Sounds like the Indians got our wagon train circled." Then there was silence once more. Every man in the group would occasionally lower his head and close his eyes. Like everyone else, the others knew he was praying. Smitty prayed silently of his own. "Assist me. Please assist us. Please, dear God. If death will help end this conflict, I don't mind, but I don't think it will. Give me the strength to do whatever tasks I have to complete, please." Lago's attempt to lighten the tense situation with a crude joke didn't work. "Click! Kabloom! Click! Kabloom! Click! Kabloom!" Woody added something as well, but click! Kabloom! Cut him off before he could finish his sentence. Click! Kabloom! Click! Kabloom! All of a sudden, there was a loud, sharp poing. As if Seal had been transformed into a gigantic gong, the sound echoed through the hull. "Sonar," Deadeye said. "He's trying to reach us." Big Ski got up, turned to face the bulkhead, and said, "That son of a bitch really has us now." Smitty had never seen Big Ski so frightened. Using their active sonar, the destroyers had targeted Seal and were echo-ranging, bouncing the signal off the defenseless sub's enormous steel hull to determine her position. The sound of depth charges was the only sound submariners feared more than this one. As if she had a huge flashing neon target painted on her side, it indicated that the destroyers knew exactly where Seal was. A picnic underwater. The submariners' quivering ears were now met with a new sound. Pop, 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 pop. It had the sound of a series of big firecrackers set underwater. "Shit. Deep bombs," Woody remarked. Click. Kabloom. Click. Kabloom. Click. Kabloom. There were 8 more depth charges and numerous bombs detonated. "They most likely have an airfield close by," Hopalong remarked. Big Ski shivered and added, "Yeah, and a goddamn bomb factory too," adding that we were nearing the end of the assembly line. Click. Kabloom. Click. Kabloom. Click. Kabloom. In the forward torpedo compartment, Big Wop Bonino kept track of the charges dropped and occasionally softly broadcast his total over the circuit. The most recent total was 212. Amazingly, they were all still alive somehow. Now that their death did not appear imminent, ideas of life, particularly of food, took precedence. One person said, "I'm starving." Another answered, "Me too." Abruptly, the soldiers began gathering their supplies and removing food cans from hidden storage areas, like beneath the spare torpedoes. A tin of soda crackers, some sardines, and numerous cans of Dole pineapples were there. The seamen opened the cans with their knives. Smitty subsequently remarked, "Aside from the extreme cold and the constant explosions of the depth charges, it would have made a nice picnic." Click. Kabloom. Click. Kabloom. Click. Kabloom. Big Ski exclaimed, "Boy, those bastards just ain't giving up," while stuffing crackers into his mouth. Time and oxygen are running low. Even though the hours passed slowly, the Japanese warships persisted in their attempts to murder the picnickers. Oddly, depth charging was becoming as commonplace as it could be. Surprisingly, Dodge was able to keep the submarine going ahead at lower power in an attempt to elude the adversary, even with SEAL's peculiar upward angle. Reports of damage were received from all over the submarine. Engine mufflers had been blown away, some vents were damaged, and the pump room was flooded and rendered inoperable. Even worse, SEAL was leaking diesel gasoline from punctured fuel tanks. The oil would create a dazzling rainbow on the ocean's surface, making it very simple for enemy destroyers to follow her whereabouts. There was also a dwindling oxygen supply, which was getting concerning. To help conserve the oxygen, Dodge instructed everyone to scatter out 5-gallon cans of a white powder that absorbs carbon dioxide. The men found it nearly impossible to keep the tobacco burning after cigarette breaks were reduced to 5 minutes each hour. Click, kabloom, click, kabloom, click, kabloom. Would it never stop? Smitty gradually came to the realization that their odds of surviving were dwindling. The water was approaching the batteries and the oxygen was running low, but the Japanese could still bomb and depth charge them until the end of time. They were only off the coast of Japan after all. A destroyer could simply pull into the closest port and reload when its depth charges ran short. How foolish was Dodge to try this stunt, Smitty thought. How foolish of the Navy to put them practically into the bathtub of the Emperor. With his arms wrapped about his bare knees and his teeth chattering from the cold, Smitty sat on the sloping deck. How foolish of him to go on this patrol without any warm clothing. His mind was filled with bitter ideas. In any case, why did we have to enter this war? When we attempted to prevent the Japanese from obtaining the steel, rubber, and oil they desired, they attacked us. What business did we have? We would have attacked them first if they had done the same to us. Why should I die for something I didn't start? Smitty asked himself. After all, as long as you have a wife and children, enough food, and are left alone, it doesn't matter what kind of government you have. The impoverished, naive fools in Germany and Japan probably feel the same way. If death would make a difference, I wouldn't mind, but it won't. What makes humanity so foolish? All of us will perish, and it won't have any bearing on the outcome of this conflict. Not only that, but we failed to sink the objective. Smitty carried on thinking in black. Additionally, the Japanese persisted in lowering their depth charges. Click, kabloom, click, kabloom, click, kabloom. Like bullies beating a puppy, the 7 sub-hunters loitered all day, taking turns happily blasting SEAL. The air in SEAL was becoming sour. Additionally, the batteries were depleting. In order to blast the ballast tanks and raise her to the surface, Smitty wasn't sure if there was even enough high-pressure air left. Smitty knew they were practically dead. It would all be over if the destroyer stayed up there for a few more hours. Perhaps he should give up and close his eyes. Click, kabloom, click, kabloom, click, kabloom. We fight to the end if we die. The date was July 9th, 1943. Many of the guys pondered whether this would be their last day as the timepiece showed 2300 hours, 11 p.m. The SEAL had been underwater for 18 hours. Harry Benjamin Dodge, lieutenant commander, had different plans. He believed that it was time to bring SEAL Tow to the surface and, if necessary, slug it out. He and his crew would undoubtedly have their names inscribed on a memorial slab someplace if he didn't. Although there was little to no hope of outrunning the enemy ships, it was still preferable to waiting for asphyxiation, which was inevitable, 365 feet below the surface. The voice on the headphones abruptly said, "Battle surface crew, report to the control room." Startled, Smitty stood up and repeated the order. "What on earth is this?" One of the other sailors in the caboose complained, but he got up as well because he was a member of the battle surface crew. Actually, Big Ski was the only person in the aft torpedo room who did not have a role on the battle surface detail, and they all filed out. When Smitty finally emerged from the chamber, he turned to face Big Ski. They looked at each other. Smitty briefly feared that he might never see Big Ski again. "Will you be all right?" Smitty inquired. As if sensing Smitty's thoughts, Ski extended his hand and shook the child, saying, "It's okay, Smitty. Kid, give them hell." All of the gun crews were already crammed into the control room, which was only lit by red bulbs to maintain night vision. To get everyone's attention, Dodge scaled a few rungs on the conning tower ladder. He declared, "I'm proud of all of you. We won't remain here and perish like rats. As Americans, we will fight this battle on the surface and, if we lose, we will fight until the end. Lieutenant Frost, show her." "Yes, sir," the diving officer said. With almost all of their energy gone, the electric motors struggled feebly to propel Seal skyward. Seal appeared to linger at a depth of 100 feet, unable to descend the final few fathoms to the oxygen-rich air above, prepared to descend again in a death dive. Then suddenly she lunged one last time, and the periscope, the bridge, and the conning tower pierced the seas. No destroyers to be seen. In order to draw air into the engines, Dodge ordered the main induction valve to be opened. Smitty remarked, "The boat's enormous engines created a vacuum that seemed like it would suck your guts out through your nose." The diesels roared to life and caught. Dodge clambered up the ladder and smashed open the hatch, letting a rush of cool, fresh air and a tiny stream of icy seawater surge into the superheated interior. The atmosphere in the control room immediately became dense with fog. Eager to harm the enemy before they perished, each soldier started to race for the ladder, following their leader, overflowing onto the deck, and grabbing their guns. Smitty ran toward his 20mm gun post, aft of the conning tower, slipping and sliding across the wet, dark deck. Since the destroyers had been up there all day licking their collective chops, waiting for Seal to surface, he opened the ammunition storage and started gathering shells as quickly as he could, feeding them to the gunner. He anticipated that Japanese shells would rake Seal at any moment. The gunners strained to see targets in the darkness as the 3-inch gun swung on its perch. The 1920s are no different. Triggers made fingers strained. It was either now or never. There was just one issue. There were no longer 7 Japanese destroyers. In an attempt to identify the enemy, the guys looked in all directions. However, there was no evidence of anything, no one, and nothing. Around them, the sea was empty, barren, and black. The crew was merrily confused. The enemy might have ran out of ammunition. Maybe they had come to the conclusion that Seal was dead on the ocean floor. Or maybe they had simply gone home because they were bored. The Japanese, for whatever reason, had disappeared, leaving Seal completely and inexplicably alone under the skies. As Seal sped off, everyone fell silent as they vacated the decks, secured from battle stations, and went back inside the sub. They thought they had just undergone an experience that was incomprehensible and beyond words. Leaving the silent service and coming back. Ron Smith met and married a young woman while on leave in the United States while Seal was being repaired and upgraded following this near-death experience. After that, Smitty was told to report to a completely renovated Seal for additional sea duty. However, he did not return to combat after receiving a diagnosis of what is now known as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. Rather, he was assigned to a military ammunition station in central Indiana after serving as an instructor at the Great Lakes Fleet Torpedo School at the Great Lakes Military Training Center in Chicago. After Smitty's marriage ended, he was released from the military and returned to Hammond's civilian life. He married Georgiana Tremchinsky in November 1946 after meeting her in nearby Calumet City, Illinois. He worked in a variety of occupations before deciding to pursue a career in the automobile sector. Despite his professed animosity of Japanese people, he eventually rose to the position of Toyota dealership owner. Prior to his passing in 2010, he resided in Austin, Texas. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief, Pacific, wrote after the war, "Only the little American submarine force kept the Japanese Empire at bay during the gloomy early months of World War II. allowing our fleets to replenish their casualties and mend their wounds. We will always remember the submarine force's bravery and spirit,